Good evening, comrades and friends. Welcome to a Socialist Action live stream video webcast. My name is Barry Wiesleder. I'm a Federal Secretary of Socialist Action and a co-editor of a couple of publications I'll show you in a moment. But you might be wondering, why this initiative? Why are we taking to the air in this fashion at this time? Well, in part, it's due to the coronavirus pandemic. It's forced us to postpone a number of our internal and external meetings. Another reason is that this medium is accessible to many people and at all times, and we intend to make much more use of it. So as I said, I'm one of the editors of Socialist Action newspaper, and surprise, surprise, the latest edition, Coronavirus Pandemic Spreads to World Stage. And on the back is an article about solidarity with the struggle of the Wet'suwet'en people against pipelines and for Indigenous sovereignty in Western Canada, across Canada. So I encourage people to read our publication. Some of the articles are posted on our website. I'm also pleased to be one of the editorial committee members of Turn Left magazine. This is the yearly magazine of the NDP Socialist Caucus, and there are many fine articles in it. So I recommend that you go to the website of the Socialist Caucus, Turn Left, and check it out for yourself. So my topic tonight is the United Front. This is a topic that's rich in history, in theory, and in current political practice. In my 50 years of political activism, I've often been asked, maybe too often asked, why is the left so divided? Why can't it unite? Well, tonight's discussion may give you some insight as to how it can be more united, at least for certain important and timely purposes. The United Front is a key element of revolutionary strategy. And in many ways, it is the answer revolutionaries give to the question, how should workers committed to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism relate to those who believe that the system can be reformed and that it does not need to be overthrown? For most of the past century, the consciousness of most workers has been reformist rather than revolutionary. Organizations committed to reform rather than revolution have dominated the workers' movement. As a result, the need for the United Front has been posed repeatedly. But the precise form taken by the United Front varies. For Leon Trotsky, who was co-leader with V.I. Lenin of the Russian Revolution, the United Front encompasses a wide range of forms, and I quote, "Just as the trade union is the rudimentary form of the United Front in the economic struggle, so the Soviet Workers' Council is the highest form of the United Front under the conditions in which the proletariat enters the epoch of fighting for power. The basic characteristics of the United Front are as follows. It draws together workers, revolutionary and non-revolutionary, in common struggle. These struggles can range from the basic defense of workers' conditions under capitalism, and that's a task that is associated with the trade unions, to the creation of a workers' state from below. That is the formation of workers' councils, workers, soldiers, and poor farmers' councils, as in the Russian example. The United Front represents a set of demands acceptable to both revolutionaries and sections of the working class who are not yet revolutionary. The United Front forces involved remain independent components of a joint endeavor. Revolutionaries are able to pursue goals independent of the United Front and articulate their wider political vision. So the motto of the United Front is, march separately, but strike together. The United Front is also a site of struggle. Within the United Front, reformist and revolutionary currents can argue about strategy and tactics. Indeed, there will always be a battle of ideas. It's a good thing. And a debate over strategy and tactics within the United Front are all good things. So it's very important, I think you can see, that there be respect for the right of different contributing tendencies to speak. That's extremely important. There has to be that kind of reciprocal respect for the norms of the workers' movement, workers' democracy, for the United Front to operate in good faith and to be welcoming and a site of political discourse and enlightenment. And finally, the United Front, in the United Front, superior ideas and methods of struggle put forward by revolutionaries should allow them to win some of the reformist workers involved in the United Front to revolutionary politics. At least that's the hope. The clearest theory of the United Front was developed by the generation of Marxists, including Trotsky, Lenin, and Antonio Gramsci, who took part in the revolutionary upsurge that followed the First World War. This was a period in which mass revolutionary organizations had to operate alongside mass reformist organizations. After the initial upsurge of the struggle ended in the early 1920s, revolutionaries were forced to deal with a period of defensive struggles. Because the working class was on the defensive, the question of working class unity and hence of the United Front was posed very sharply. So take a step back and you'll see that Trotsky justified the United Front long before he could practice it. He justified it by quoting Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels from a very famous passage in the Communist Manifesto. And I quote, "The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. The communists are, on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, the communists have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement." Close quote. I do recommend you pick up a copy of the Communist Manifesto for your own delight. Russia in 1917 did not have the kind of mass reformist parties that were developing in Germany, Britain, and elsewhere. However, reformist consciousness remained dominant in the working class. Any working class compelled to sell its labor party, which is ruled in the workplace by bosses and managers, will contain a mixture of ideas, some based on struggle and solidarity, some based on resignation and acceptance of ruling class ideas. Because of the specific experiences of individual workers that differ, the consciousness of the class will be quite uneven. Lenin's concept of the party is the beginning of the solution to this problem of unevenness. It draws together the workers with the most advanced ideas. It arms them with the theoretical tools, the arguments, the strategies, and tactics to lead other workers forward. The Leninist Party is the brain of the working class. The United Front is the other crucial element of the solution. It was in the struggle against General Kornilov's coup attempt, this is in the throes of the Russian Revolution in 1917 that began in February, but in the summer, there was an attempt to drive it all backwards when sections of the military, the Tsar's military, organized a coup and conspired to rob the workers of their fragile gains and to drive them back. It was during this period, in the summer of 1917, that the Bolsheviks won over the bulk of the Russian working class. The struggle to defend the conciliators had exposed the conciliators. What do I mean by that? Well, Alexander Kerensky was the prime minister in the multi-class government that came out of the Spring Uprising. And it couldn't end the First Imperialist War, Russia's participation in it. It couldn't give land to the peasants. It couldn't satisfy the democratic needs of the vast population of the Tsarist Empire, including the right of nations to self-determination. So the approach the Bolsheviks took was, well, we're going to defend the government, conciliators, against the general, Kornilov, who would drown us all in blood. And so this allowed the Bolsheviks eventually to win a majority in the Soviets and the workers' councils. Previously, these bodies were dominated by the Mensheviks and Social Revolutionaries, two other reformist parties. But even at the high point of the revolution, in the October insurrection, the United Front remained crucial. It was the Revolutionary Military Committee of the Soviets, the Workers' Councils, democratically elected from the bottom up, chaired by Trotsky, that committee was, which organized the insurrection and handed power over to the General Assembly of the Soviets. The Bolsheviks didn't take power in their name. They rallied the class and its respected organizations, and it took the power, and it was the repository of the power, and then it was a question of which party within that new power would form the government. Leap forward to 1919. The Third International, the Communist International, formed in March 1919. It was known for short as the Comintern, was the child of the 1917 revolution. It was formed as revolts that accompanied the end of the First World War, convulsed much of Europe. Initially, it was made up of a handful of small parties, but a series of splits in reformist organizations meant that by early 1921, parties affiliated to the Comintern had the support of the majority of the politically conscious European workers in at least 6 countries: France, Italy, Norway, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and, I need to grow one more finger, Czechoslovakia. And they enjoyed support of a substantial minority of the workers in other countries, Germany, Sweden, and Poland. Unfortunately, by this time, the revolutionary tide was ebbing, and serious errors committed by the Comintern-backed KPD, the German Communist Party, in 1921 and 1923, and this is really the topic for another lecture, serious errors by the KPD in early 20s squandered the potential for revolution in Germany. And I'll tell you this, if Germany had gone communist in the early 1920s, there would have been no Nazism. The whole world by now would be socialist. That's my conviction. In any case, it didn't turn out that way. And in 1924, the Comintern, at its last healthy World Congress, in a document titled "To the Masses," adopted the United Front perspective. So Comintern, 1924, the United Front. We draw from those roots. One very important byproduct of the defeat of the revolutionary wave in Western Europe was the rise of Stalinism in isolated Russia. That in turn led to the imposition on the Western communist parties of policies that bore little connection to the realities of the class struggle. From 1928 to 1934, this meant the policies of the notorious Third Period, involving the revival of the worst, involved the revival of the worst ultra-left positions. Let me explain by example. The Comintern executive decreed in July 1929, and I quote, "In countries where there are strong social democratic parties, fascism assumes the particular form of social fascism." Close quote. Such an analysis led the German communist leaders to make light of the real fascist threat of the Nazis, treating them as no greater a danger than the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party. Now, to be sure, communist militants did fight the Nazis heroically in the streets, in cities such as Berlin, but the policy of their leaders meant that they did so in isolation from the wider working class movement. They didn't try to forge a unity with them. In fact, they said the SPD is social fascist, as great a danger as the Nazis. This was a criminal policy, which, we still bear the scars of it. If Germany showed the danger of not fighting for unity, the late 1930s would show a different danger, the wrong kind of unity. In 1934, the mood of socialist and communist militants, horrified by the victory of the Nazis in Germany the year before, forced their leaders into united action against attempts to bring far-right governments to office in France and in Spain. There were huge demonstrations on the streets of Paris in February and a rising in Asturias in Spain in October. But at this point, a new line emerged from Joseph Stalin in Moscow. It was the line of the Popular Front. What do we mean by the Popular Front? It meant that communists would seek alliances not just with the Social Democrats, but also with liberal mainstream capitalist parties. Any notion of political struggle was subordinated to Moscow's foreign policy goal, the formation of a military alliance with French imperialism, and they hoped with British imperialism as well. Anyone who thinks that these stories of long ago have little relevance today is mistaken. Popular front politics, that is, the subordination of workers' parties to the liberal bourgeoisie and to the capitalist state, are still alive. The demise of the Salvador Allende Popular Unity government in Chile in 1973, the legal coup against the Workers' Party in Brazil in 2016, and the overthrow of the Evo Morales MAS, the movement towards socialism in Bolivia last fall, are products of popular front politics. That is where the workers' parties combine with capitalist parties, hoping to persuade the liberals to be reasonable and to keep the military at bay and to make progress towards some kind of socialism. Okay, what about Canada? Do you remember when the NDP, the Liberals under Stéphane Dion, and the Bloc Québécois formed an alliance to displace Stephen Harper Tories late in 2010? Well, Harper dodged the bullet by proroguing Parliament. Remember that funny word, proroguing? It means wiping the slate clean, putting off the agenda, and starting afresh with a new parliamentary sitting some months down. Well, Harper managed to hang on to government until March 2011, and then he won an election, unfortunately. But I want to dwell on the combination. That Liberal NDP Bloc Québécois combo was a popular front in the making. Socialist Action opposed it in principle. Guess who supported it? Guess who wanted even to join it, but for their tiny forces? The Communist Party of Canada. No surprise, the CP is still loyal to Stalin's treacherous strategy of seeking a governmental alliance with the liberal bourgeoisie. In fact, the Communist Party, even when such an alliance is not in the cards, not even remotely, they say they're for socialism at some point, but they're for advanced democracy in the short run. And that means a government consisting, they hope, of themselves, some part of the NDP, and the progressive wing of the Liberal Party. And that's how they understand it. So now I want to turn to the application of the United Front in Canada today. And after I give some examples, perhaps we'll have a dialogue about our own experiences in relation to some of these issues and some of these configurations of forces. So I'm going to talk about the NDP Socialist Caucus, the Workers' Action Movement, the Toronto Venezuela Solidarity Coalition, Canadian Coalition for BDS, Canadian Network on Cuba, and some others, okay? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each, but I invite folks to write in their questions and comments, and for us to dialogue about it as well. So the NDP Socialist Caucus, it was founded in 1997 by Socialist Action and Left Social Democrats and Libertarian Socialists. There are other groups that emerged in the NDP later, but never participated in the Socialist Caucus. I'm referring, I hope it's not out of season to say, Fight Back and the current group now known as Courage. Well, Fight Back is no longer involved in the NDP, but they were for about 10 years and never could find the time to come to a meeting. I think they were politically allergic to the idea that we can work together to try to push the only mass labor party in North America to the left. Some groups take this attitude because they think, well, if we don't control the campaign, we don't want to get involved in it because that'll help somebody else. Yeah, somebody else like the working class, perhaps? In any case, the Socialist Caucus strives to do what? It strives to push the NDP sharply to the left. Currently, it is campaigning for an NDP federal convention in 2020. Why? Because the NDP constitution says there should be a convention every 2 years, and the previous convention was in February 2018 in Ottawa. I know this because I was there. Some of you were too. The current leadership, after the stellar result in the October 2019 federal election in which the NDP lost 500,000 votes and 20 seats, believes that there's no need for a leadership review. We don't need a convention and we can't afford one. a convention can be held. In fact, it can be a fundraiser if done correctly. And what price democracy? So the Socialist Caucus is fighting for that. And it's also fighting for nationalization under workers' control of big oil and gas, the giant banks, the auto industry, and big pharma. And why? I mean, we could pick other sectors, but I draw attention to those because if we're going to avoid climate catastrophe, we need to make a shift from the carbon-based economy to a green economy. And that's not going to be done by the market alone. That's going to require not just a vigorous intervention, it's going to require workers' control of the energy resource sector, I think. You know, the auto industry just shut down an operation in Oshawa, which had been producing cars for over a century, leaving thousands of Oshawa workers, their families, and people in the ancillary industries, related industries, high and dry. That auto complex should be taken over and should be used to produce the green vehicles that we need. For example, to provide a fleet of electric vehicles for the post office, which is the most extensive network in the country. We also need postal banking and other things as well, and places where people could plug in their electric vehicles of the future at postal depots. So these are some of the proposals that the Socialist Caucus makes. The Workers' Action Movement. Just as there's a need for a united front to push the NDP to the left, there is also a need for a united front in the labor movement. Not all workers are organized, but in Canada, over 4.5 million, over 5 million are organized. So that's a very important site of political contestation and for program and strategy to take us out of the nightmare of capitalist environmental disaster and towards a world worth fitting for human beings. So the Workers' Action Movement was refounded in 2016 by who? By Socialist Action, but also by anarchists, also by independent leftists. The Workers' Action Movement, we fondly referred to it as WHAM, as in wham the bosses, fights for an end to concessions bargaining, for a general strike to dump Thug Ford. We just had all 4 teachers' federations on strike at the same time for a day in Ontario. And there was no discussion about elongating that mode of struggle and drawing on the rest of the labor movement to bring down this hated government. We also fight, the Workers' Action Movement does, for union democracy. Our unions are sadly lacking in it, and we want to see a lot more of it. And we think that when the rank and file have control over their unions, the unions can become instruments of class struggle rather than class collaboration. The Toronto Venezuela, yeah, I want to mention one more thing about the Workers' Action Movement. It's not just a fringe phenomenon. It ran candidates at the Ontario Federation of Labour for the 2 of the top 3 positions at the OFL. Can you see this?
Yep.
We were delighted to run Kurt Young, who's with us here, and Barry Conway, who's an anarchist brother, who ran for president. And Kurt and Barry got, you know, between 35 and 36% of the vote of all the delegates at the convention last November. Not the kind of result associated with a marginal group. This shows that there's an appetite for a new kind of labor movement, one that puts movement back into the labor movement, that is responsive to the ranks, directed by them to fight the bosses rather than to give away what it took us 40 years to win. This is an example of what can be done, and it's an example of what we hope to do at the convention of the Canadian Labour Congress. It was supposed to be in May in Vancouver, but because of this crisis, which brings us to this video experience, it's been postponed. So maybe in the fall or next year, but we're gearing up for a socialist intervention there. The Toronto Venezuela Solidarity Coalition. Who's involved? Independent Latinos from every country in Central and South America, Socialist Action, the Communist Party of Canada, and some independent folks. The Venezuela Solidarity Coalition defends the elected government of Nicolas Maduro against imperialist intervention. The members of the coalition have a different evaluation of the nature of this government. Some will say it's a socialist government. I would say it is a bourgeois democratic, bourgeois nationalist government. I defend its achievements. Its achievements in the field of social housing are like a modern wonder of the world. Building, over 3 million units, housing over 6 million people. It's an example that Toronto could well follow to its advantage. But without illusions in the government, it's the right of the people of Venezuela to decide their own fate, their own government, the future of their society. And we insist on an end to Canadian interference through the Organization of American States and the brazen efforts of Trump and Washington and Wall Street to overthrow a democratically elected government. So we can work together in the Venezuela Solidarity Coalition. And then there's the Canadian Coalition for Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, and Palestinian Self-Determination. Involved in it, and I'll be briefer in these examples, involved in the Canadian Coalition for BDS are Socialist Action, Independent Jewish Voices, different Palestinian organizations, including Palestine House, religious pacifists, and independent leftists. Within the framework of that broad coalition, a united front in miniature, if you will, Socialist Action initiated a cross-country day of action for Palestine last May. In Toronto, we had 400 to 500 people take to the streets and occupy Canada's busiest intersection, Yonge and Bloor, where the Israeli consulate is situated nearby. We strive to do something even bigger all across the country this coming May 16th. Then there's the Canadian Network on Cuba. Involved in this network was founded long ago. Involved in it, the Communist Party of Canada, Communist Party of Canada, Marxist-Leninist, the Communist League, and Socialist Action. We joined the CNC in 2018, but that was 4 years after the Communist Party of Canada first blocked our membership. So we had to try and try and try again. And eventually the Cubans themselves said, these folks have been supporting the Cuban Revolution since 1960. Why are they not in your coalition? So certain resistance relented, and we were in it, and we're proud members of it. And recently, a couple of us went down to Havana for an important anti-imperialist conference. The Toronto May Day Coalition. This is an effort to have a militant, broad May Day demonstration in the streets on May 1st, Friday, May 1st. There have been efforts in recent years which have been at odds with some ultra-left groups oriented towards identity politics and starting the march up in the middle of nowhere in North York. I mean, literally, I'm not anti-North York. I grew up in North York, but it was a vacant field near Keele and Shepherd. And finally, a group of union activists have got it back down, to the city center where May Day demonstrations take place, typically in cities all over the world. At any rate, CUPE Local 4400, good on you. Fight Back is involved, and Socialist Action is involved. And it's a positive example of where we need to go. And here's a negative example. Sorry, but the truth will out. The campaign against the Ontario law that forbids protests against fascists and racists on campus. This was initiated, to their credit, by the Fight Back group at Ryerson a couple of years ago. Ford brought in this regulation. It said, if you're going to disrupt racists and fascists on campus, at Ryerson or any campus, we're going to cut off funds, we're going to levy fines, we might even put some people in jail. So it was certainly an issue worth protesting. And Fight Back organized a street rally on Ryerson campus, but it wasn't really a united front. It was just covered with their own materials, flags, banners, signs, all signed. We came to participate. There were 4 or 5 or 6 of us. We asked to speak, and we were told, no, there isn't time. Turns out there were 6 speakers, 3 from the same organization. We could have easily had time for a 2 or 3 minute speech. But the important thing here is not gripes about being denied the right to speak, although that's troubling enough. if we understand the rich history of the United Front, we understand the need for mutual respect, for inclusion, and for different forces to come together. In other words, we march separately, but we strike together. And that's what was needed there and was lacking. And we hope the comrades to whom I referred will think about this and in reflection consider that there's a better way that we can work together. So, Socialist Action is by far the party most committed to advancing the United Front in theory and in practice. Why? Because, one, unity and struggle of workers' organizations and the left offers the best hope for victory both in the short run and the long run. And two, Socialist Action is confident in our program, in our proposals for action. Only parties that lack political self-confidence have a problem with the United Front. Parties that are afraid of exposing their members to other political tendencies, and parties that refuse to perform the necessary hard exertions in organizing, as opposed to indulging in sterile polemics against their political opponents on the left. I won't name any names. Only such parties reject the United Front. In short, Socialist Action is committed to the United Front approach because it is the road to the masses and we are not afraid to win. Thanks very much. So I'm joined by Julius, Kurt, Daniel, Will, and Corey is on the camera, but he's got a voice and he can be heard.
Hello.
So, folks, you might have some thoughts, your own reflections, your own experience. The floor is open.
So I'll just begin then. So I'm just going to talk a bit on Daniel. So what brought me to Socialist Action, I got into the movement through environmental causes. I went to a rally organized by Earthstrike. It was a very small rally. And one of the few leftist voices there was Socialist Action. It was actually Barry selling newspapers and lending solidarity. That's how I got added to the mailing list. And since then, I am heartened to see how many events our group attends, even if we're not the ones that organized it, called for it, or even have speaking members. Recent examples include a rally for ending war with Iran and any escalation there. We came, we supported, and so that's important. So I just want to speak a little bit then about the environmental issues. A lot of the coalitions you mentioned are really important, obviously, solidarity with different groups in their struggle against imperialism, etc. The environmental movement has something akin maybe to a united front, but it's lacking any sort of labor or leftist leadership or even solidarity. You have a lot of different environmental groups that can come together regardless of who throws an event. An example is Fridays for Future. They have a Friday walkout, and there's going to be a lot of different environmental and leftist groups that show up. But the organization and the discussion and the policy and those things are somewhat lacking from leftist groups. And that's something that we need a broader scope, obviously. And that brings me a bit to Extinction Rebellion. It was a group that I've been involved with. I do support them because they're very direct. They've raised a very important discussion regarding a lot of environmental issues. But one of their explicit values is being apolitical. They don't stand for electoralism, and I think that's something that we can maybe understand at some level, but there's no explicit endorsement of socialist ideas, even though many of their members, either in Toronto or around the world, obviously are of a socialist persuasion. Mm-hmm. They understand that there's no free market solution to the issues they're talking about, but they're trying to make the movement as accommodating as possible. And I think they're trying to avoid the baggage of any term. Mm-hmm. Maybe a throwback to the Red Scare. They don't want to call themselves socialist or communist or explicitly take those ideas. So is there a comment on that then? What would you say to people within Extinction Rebellion regarding how they should move forward when it comes to having a united front?
Let's hear from some other folks.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to kind of echo what you were saying, comrade, because I think that it seems like there is a real hesitation to involve voices of the revolutionary left in the activist community at large. And we're based in Toronto right now, but I think that it's all over Canada and the United States. But I think it is important, and I think as part of that and as a continuation of the Red Scare, in some cases, you have revolutionary parties such as the International Socialists, which have, in recent years, played leadership roles in creating a lot of demonstrations and participating in a lot of these different, I guess you could say, United Front groups. But they keep other groups on the left out, and it's not just us; it's other revolutionary groups on the left, and it's a problem. And I think that it adds a lot of richness to the discussion when, for instance, at the recent Palestine demo a few months ago, Palestine Solidarity demonstrations, we spoke there. I spoke there as a representative of Socialist Action, and I was the only representative of a revolutionary party on the left who actually spoke at that demonstration, which is fine for us, but it would have been good to hear from other folks as well. This is really what we need, because it really comes down to the question of capitalism. And I think that question, the activist world has really been ignoring until more recently. It's come up quite a bit, with Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, the attractiveness of those electoral campaigns and Boss's parties. Except for maybe the question around the British Labour Party, but wouldn't have happened if people didn't start to ask those questions. It's time to take a step further to the left to be inclusive of the revolutionary left in our movements.
I have kind of a slightly different type of thing to comment on, which is...
This is Will, by the way.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Will. And what I would want to talk about is the fact that in my perception, it seems to me that the right or the capitalists have a united front as it stands now. This is one of the major things that when I look at the whole thing in its totality, one of the biggest problems I can see is that they currently are a united front. Like, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with the liberals and conservatives in Canada, who both have more or less the same ideas, tiny margin of difference between them, and they're capitalists. I mean, that's the way it works. You can also see this around the world, where all kinds of different right-wing groups are aligned with each other, and they are currently in that that situation right now. I would say that a good example of it is the Christian groups in the United States, which operate in both the Democratic and Republican parties, and sometimes the same, like, members of either party will be members of the exact same group. That is a fairly right-wing organization, which leads them to having that kind of power. And I think that part of what socialists, communists, anarchists, all these people have to realize is that we're kind of fighting from the bottom up. And when you're doing that, there's a higher challenge that you have to face, because the people in the capitalist class, their united front yields a lot of material advantage in the short term. Our united front doesn't always. Sometimes it does. There are lots of, I don't mean to downplay the real gains that we have made, but there are times when you're just going to have to be struggling, and that is a slightly different point of departure. And so I think that one thing we should realize is that the right has a united front where we don't.
So we have questions from our chat. YC asks, can you offer a bit more history in the formation of the VSOL Toronto, and which factions were most vigorous in founding this united front? When was it formed, and how did it form, and what was the original mission statement? And why has there been no popular front for nationwide taxes? Those are all from YC.
For nationwide taxes?
Tax-wide revolt. Nationwide tax revolt. Okay, that's from YC. Elizabeth asks, what kind of united front would come from this? And Peter DeGama asks, is Dimitri Lascaris' bid for Green Party leadership an example to build a united front on the electoral front? Should SA support this bid? And this is also a continuation from Rob McBean. This goes with Peter's question, what is the way to deal with middle-class liberals and Greens in the united front? Okay.
Okay. I don't presume that those questions are necessarily intended exclusively for me, but I'll answer a couple of them. There's a lot of youthful, brilliant energy in Extinction Rebellion. It's a worldwide movement. It's huge in Britain, but it is worldwide. And I was proud to participate with XR in the blockade that took place on the Bloor Aqueduct. When was that?
October.
Last October, yeah. And our banner was there, and even though it's signed, some people who are not members of our party volunteered to carry it because they thought it was brilliant. And Julius made it, so good for you. But the fact that XR is anti-political, I think, it's an overreaction to sectarianism. The left and political parties generally have a tendency towards being sectarian. And I don't mean it in the sense of abstention from struggle, although that's true for much of the Canadian radical left. They simply prefer to argue with each other rather than build any campaigns. But sectarian in the sense that, well, we've got the answer to all the problems, so step aside and we'll show you how to do it. So the young people who are drawn to XR don't have much patience for that. That's good, but don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's important to understand that politics is about changing society. Politics is about power. And, we can make power okay. Power is misused against the majority, but it can be transformed if the power is seized by the vast majority, or in the interest of the vast majority, political power changes are made. So politics is about changing the system. After all, our slogan, and XR, I believe, is system change, not climate change. So how do you change the system unless you name it, and unless you name an alternative for which you're striving? So that's all about politics. There's another thing we have to argue with our comrades, sisters and brothers in XR, and that is about democracy. Okay, we may not agree at the moment on, whether there should be open political identification, whether ideas from the socialist left should be on the agenda at XR meetings rather than just the tactics of a banner drop. I know there's more than that. I didn't mean to suggest to minimize it, but respect for the right to argue strategy as well as tactics and policy is important. No movement can survive without it. And so I think we should make the argument that it's in the interests of XR and of all, eco-socialists and eco-warriors, if I can use that expression, to, reserve some time on the agenda without overpowering the important tactical debates and material arrangements required for every successful action, to have a discussion about politics. I don't think it has to be intimidating or negative. The ruling class has the united front. Well, never have words truer been said about the present situation. Let's give an example. Pipelines. Justin Trudeau campaigned going into the October federal election that he was for reconciliation with Indigenous people, that he was for a green agenda, that there would be a way of resolving the overcommitment, the commitment to the carbon economy. And what did he do? As soon as he gained government, minority government, albeit, he bought a pipeline, for $4.5 billion and prepared to spend another $7 billion to double track it through unceded Indigenous territory. So this is an aha moment, it shows you that the ruling class gets its policies, gets its tax concessions, gets its pipelines, gets its interventions to try to overthrow governments like the one in Venezuela, regardless who forms the government. So that's their united front. Our united front has to be one that aspires to challenge that and present, a well-reasoned and effective argument for an alternative way of living. And we need to bring together the different forces of the left, of the workers' movement. The left is relatively small. The workers' movement is multi-million, and that's what we need to move into action. We have to keep our eyes on the ranks. And if we do the right things, others on the left will take note and will be part of it, or they'll be irrelevant. We want everyone to be relevant. We want to work together with everybody. And so we hope that we can join together in the fight against neoliberalism, and that's going to require challenging and indeed pushing to the left the existing organizations of the working class. And in English Canada, Those are the unions affiliated to the Canadian Labour Congress and the Labour-based NDP. There's no getting around that. You ignore that at your peril, or you become irrelevant. There was the question about the Venezuela Solidarity Coalition. I don't have a lot to add about that because I wasn't around when it was formed. We've been part of it for the past 2 years, I think. I think it was formed 2 or 3 or 4 years before that, at least 2 years before that. Fightback at one time was involved in it, and then they just dropped out, just like they dropped out of the NDP. They drop out of everything periodically and become kind of like a Jesuits college, you know, to train the people who will uphold the faith, rather than engaging in real political action on the ground with others. Why hasn't there been a tax revolt? I think it's overdue. Let's hope when people see, well, all of a sudden there's a lot of money, at least the Trudeau government claims, for people affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Money is going to be put into people's pockets to support the private sector economy. Where did that money come from? And why can't the rich be taxed? Why do we spend so much money on the Canadian military? Why do we spend so much money on, you know, depletion allowances for oil corporations? Why do we force people to buy life insurance and health insurance when society should be able to provide those needs without that kind of parasitic involvement of a private sector? And lastly, there was Peter's question about Dimitri Lascaris and his bid for the leadership of the Green Party. I like Dimitri very much. He's a brilliant and dedicated civil liberties lawyer, but I think he's wasting his time. But the question is, could the intervention in the Green Party in some way contribute to the formation of a united front? Well, the Green Party is a capitalist party. And so for the Green Party and the NDP, the only existing mass working class party in North America, to come together, to coalesce, would be a death sentence for the NDP. It means that the NDP would be subordinate to the aims and to the social base of the Green Party, which is basically rich and middle income, let's say petty bourgeois voters across the country who think that they need a party that is neither left nor right. That's how the Green Party markets itself as a political party, neither left nor right. Well, unfortunately, labels matter. And if you're neither left nor right, it means that you're for the capitalist status quo, because we're entrenched in a failed system. To get out of it, we need to turn sharply to the left. So the kind of united front that we need is not with a capitalist party, even if it's a small capitalist party like the Green Party. Due to the contradictions within the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, the Green Party is actually gaining some momentum, but it's not in the interests of working people. So that's not the prototype of a united front. What we need is the unions, including the unions that are presently not aligned with any political party, unions in the public sector and in the building trades and many others, which have been aligned either with the Liberal Party or no party, need to be aligned with the Party of Labor and to fight for a workers' agenda within it. And that's the model of the united front for which we fight.
Good.
I'm being prompted to ask questions of. They're not our guests; they're our comments.
Very sure.
I can't think of any.
Can I say
Corey
something?
has a
Can I
question.
say something with
Go
the Green Party? It's interesting with the Green Party in BC with the in a coalition sort of. It's not quite a coalition with the NDP, right? And we know that they need the Green votes to pass any legislation. So they're basically held hostage by the Green votes, as the Greens are held hostage by the NDP. So they have this relationship, right?
In British Columbia.
Yes.
Right, the Horgan government.
So it's not a real coalition, but it is a de facto coalition, right? So it's stopped NDP labor legislation from going through, right? And it's also stopped more progressive environmental legislation from going through. So both parties have suffered for this coalition, which it is, right? I don't know. What do you call it? A united front or a popular front?
Well, it's a corridor coalition. There are no Green Party ministers in the BC provincial government.
But would it have been better for the NDP to force another election and hoping that they would then get more seats instead of having to tie in with the Greens here?
No, not necessarily. I'm not close enough to be able to make a definitive judgment on that. We have comrades in British Columbia. I would ask them for their opinion. But it seems to me, to the extent that the NDP is capable in the given election result to implement the most progressive aspects of its program, it should attempt to do so. And the arrangement with the Green Party is not cabinet seats, but they would agree to support the government in terms of its budget and in terms of its main legislation. But unfortunately, they also have the capacity with, what, 3 seats in British Columbia?
3 or 4.
3 or 4 seats in BC, and the NDP not having an absolute majority in the legislature there, to say that reform of the labor legislation that would allow workers to organize a union more easily, that is with a simple majority of cards signed by workers in a given bargaining in a given workplace or allied workplaces, the Green Party opposed that. So it shows that the Green Party is looking after the interests of capital, small capital, big capital, combination of the two, and that's very problematic. There'll be an election in British Columbia soon enough, and hopefully the NDP will win and win on socialist policies for which we are fighting every day in the party and in the labor movement.
So I just think that we should, because we've talked about the NDP and the Green Party a lot, but we should probably talk about the labor movement a little bit and the work that we do, the United Front tactic and how we use it within the labor movement. You had talked, Barry, you talked about the Workers' Action Movement and how it's a relatively new United Front movement, a group of activists. We work with anarchists, we work with other folks, independent folks on the left, to change and challenge the status quo in the labor movement. We want to fight, we campaign on fighting concessions bargaining, for union democracy, and for an active labor movement. And I've been on the executive board of my union, on the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. And
Ministry of the Environment, I hear tell.
Ministry of Environment, that's right.
They used to call it climate change. They've given up on that part.
Well, they solved it apparently. It's not needed in the title anymore.
And I didn't notice. Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah. Well, you will. We all will, unfortunately. But the leadership of the labor movement often strays away from real United Front action. If there's ever an event, like the most recent one that I could think of was Occupy, which was almost 10 years ago. Unions might put together, they might put some money together and buy a yurt and some porta potties because they want to appear, leadership wants to appear like they are doing something and supporting.
Do folks know what a yurt is?
A yurt is like a tent. Look it up on Google.
Yeah. That was Office's contribution to the occupation in the park.
St. James Park
Toronto, on Queen Street. Yeah.
And this is the sort of tactic. I mean, OPSU, for instance, is a $100 million a year organization. We work in the labor movement because it is the organized wing of organized labor, of organized workers. They have the resources that they can throw behind building the kind of united fronts that we need to have to really challenge the austerity agenda in a real way. And that's a whole other thing.
But it would have been brilliant had OPSU actually organized some walkouts during lunch hour or study sessions or even, heaven forbid, a strike to support Occupy instead of erecting a yurt.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not against yurts, and I'm not against the Asian culture from which they spring, but this is not the way to make an impression on Bay Street. One reason they had it in that park was its proximity to the stock exchange.
And that's to say nothing of international solidarity, in which not all the labor movement or not all the labor leadership, but much of it has completely abstained and in many cases have actually, unfortunately, supported reactionary regimes. There's a great book called Left Right by Eve Engler, or is it Left? I can't remember.
Left Right.
Left Right, which documents the history partially of the labor movement in supporting all kinds of terrible regimes around the world, including the Israeli apartheid government from its foundation. And
supporting reactionary Canadian foreign policy.
Absolutely.
Across the board.
And supporting arms manufacturing, all that stuff.
And the CCF and the NDP.
That's right.
Eve goes into it.
Yeah. So, you know, it's the need to build a united front exists across the workers' movement, not just, as you say, not just amongst groups on the left, which are mostly very small, but most importantly, amongst the working class as a whole. And so, yeah, I want to say that.
Okay, so I'm just going to add a few comments from our comrade Yukun before you guys wrapped it up. And he adds 3 comments. And it says, my point is in response to Rob's question, possibly look back to Engels, how the early international labor movement coalition was the Social Democrats. So he's referring to, you know, the question on
Green Party.
On the Green Party. And then Green Party seems like fails in too much detailed agenda rather than creates larger manifesto. Is there such potential danger within labor movement? And is there danger in the labor movement to fight in every reforms and welfare and gradually losing own characteristic? So
I'm not sure I really get it, but I will say that Engels was alive when the German Social Democratic Party was formed, and Marx and Engels even critiqued the some different manifestos of the SPD in its early years, and they thought it was really important to have a party that brought together the main bastions of the working class. But you know, Lenin had a slightly different idea that you couldn't have the entire working class in one party, not just because it's physically impossible, but because there are different political streams of thought in the working class movement. It's necessary to have a vanguard party that had links to the other working class organizations and strive to transform society in a definite way, in accordance with a revolutionary strategy, not relying on electoral parliamentary tactics, and certainly not entering into bourgeois governments, which social democrats routinely do in Germany and in France and other countries. In fact, the first bourgeois coalition with the Workers' Party was with a fellow socialist by the name of Millerand in France. It's now known as Millerandism, where workers and socialists join bourgeois governments because they think they can, you know, conquer from within. It's like an allegory of the theory of the state that reformists propagate. That is, we don't have to engage in violence and overthrow the state. No, we'll creep into the state through the side and back doors, and before they wake up, we'll have transformed it. Unfortunately, they're awake 24/7. They know what you're doing. They force you to adapt to the state, not the other way around. And that's not a prescription for the United Front. So a key element of the United Front in relation to Germany in the 19th century or Canada in the 21st century is class independence. The working class must be organizationally and politically independent of the parties and institutions of capitalist rule. Without that independence, we're lost. And so if eco-socialists from the Green Party, after our good friend Dimitri loses the leadership, which I think is virtually inevitable, decide to come into the revolutionary left, into socialist action or into some kind of future party which welcomes all the components of the revolutionary left on an equal basis, that would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. And so the tale will be told by what kind of a campaign he wages in the Green Party. It's not something I would do or that I support, but if he wages an eco-socialist campaign on a revolutionary program and draws together like-minded people in that party who, in their moment of frustration, leave that party and help us build a mass party which is ecological and socialist, I think that's wonderful. And in fact, that's what we stand for. And we articulate this idea in one of our new publications. It's called Eco-Socialism versus Fossil Capitalism. It's a booklet, very easy to read. Just what is it, 20 to 25 pages. I also recommend that folks look up and purchase, come to one of our events after the coronavirus crisis is over. The Struggle of Indigenous People in Canada Against Canadian Capitalist Oppression and Genocide by Gary Porter. This is a position adopted by Socialist Action at our convention a year ago. We also published before the October federal election, the NDP Fight for Socialist Policies, Join and Build the NDP Socialist Caucus. We have study groups. This is a book that we are discussing on a monthly basis. Sadly interrupted tonight because of the aforementioned crisis, but I recommend that you buy it, and you can get it on our literature table in Toronto. Trotsky as Alternative by Ernest Mandel. And there are many other good titles, and of course, our newspaper. Don't forget that. Get your copy of Socialist Action.
So I'm just gonna speak. We've been at this for an hour, so I believe it would be best if our participants, have a final word, and then finally have Barry commit the ultimate final word.
So I just want to comment. So this is slightly higher level discussion, and it's really important, and it's great to talk about what's happening in Toronto now. So I just want to draw on the experience I think a lot of us had at the International Women's Day parade. And that, for a lot of us, especially people that are new to the revolutionary left, was quite eye-opening, where you can see the sectarianism in real time, where you have 5, 6, 7 revolutionary parties, and they're physically separated. They have their own literature, and at times it felt like we were all individually vultures waiting for the other independents to walk into the rally, and we're all trying to get them to grab our leaflet, our thing. And would that not have been an opportunity for us to be under one common banner, because we're all there supporting the idea of socialist feminism? Maybe some of our policies differ, and I can't purport to be an expert on all the minutiae of the different groups and their history within different feminist movements. But optics-wise, it came across very divisive. How, as a person who may have an inkling for socialism or revolution in your heart, come here where there's 7 different groups that seems so fractured? How do you even decide to join any of them if that's the state of the affairs? Especially for the people that aren't coming from the historical perspective, people that weren't even around in the 60s, maybe the last time there was an uprising. What do we do about that going forward? Would that not have been a good opportunity, or are these groups that are currently existing, is there just too much tension there? Those are my final thoughts.
My final thoughts have to do with the changing nature of labor relations generally. The way I look at things is that the world is changing a little bit because of contract work and all this gig employment, and also just the nature of what we're actually doing. A lot of things can be done remotely. And so not typically, I shouldn't say that yet, but there is a tendency for young people to be employed in situations where they don't have a workplace. I kind of view that as a way forward for us. I think that can present a good organizational opportunity in a lot of ways, because on one hand, they're fragmented, they're fractured, they're separate. But on the other hand, they are lacking the type of thing that seems to hold capitalism together, which is the hierarchical, rather fascist model of a corporation. So the fact that they exist completely outside of that might actually allow them to express their own, perhaps revolutionary or at any rate maybe reformist ideas more clearly, because they don't have to worry about repercussions from their immediate management and stuff like that. So it's just an idea, maybe something, Barry, you can comment on.
Yeah, and I'll just be really brief, but I think that just wanted to reflect a little bit on part of what Barry started with, and that is that there have always been divisions on the left throughout time. And when I joined the revolutionary socialist movement, 12 years ago, I had similar feelings of why are there all these different groups? But you learn over time that there are political differences, and that's fine. There's no problem with having political differences. It's really about testing your political theories to what's actually happening on the ground, and finding out whether or not your position is correct or whether or not it needs to be changed. The issue is United Front, and the importance of the revolutionary left and all of the workers' movement really using the United Front as a tactic in order for us to to win reforms, but also to win, you know, the ultimate prize, which is workers' power.
This has been a really good discussion. Where else do you find this kind of discussion on the internet? So I think we're going to do it again. I think we're going to have more topics. I don't know about the frequency. I hope this disease crisis ends as quickly and as harmlessly as possible. But you know, this affords us an opportunity to use this medium. International Women's Day. Well, I think Julius answered the question in a sense. You know, when did the working class come to power? Well, there was the Paris Commune of 1871, and that lasted a month or two. Winnipeg General Strike wasn't really an insurrection, although a democratically elected strike committee did run the city for, you know, 45 days. But it was really a fight for union recognition. But the Russian Revolution in 1917. And in the course of the Russian Revolution and in all subsequent revolutions, there's a multiplicity of parties. You know, there were three branches of the social revolutionaries. There were the Mensheviks, and the Mensheviks split into two parties during 1917. And there were the Bolsheviks, and even within the Bolsheviks, there were differences. Except the Bolsheviks had a democratic party. And so even when Zinoviev and Kamenev said, no, we're against the insurrection occurring in November, and they put it in writing, in the newspaper, in the daily newspaper of the party. And Lenin thought they should be expelled for this act of treachery. The party Central Committee said, no, they're wrong, but you know, we'll live with that. We're united and we're going to make a revolution and they'll come along. So, you know, these tendencies are a way for the working class to test different ideas. That is the ultimate democratic idea in practice. You have these different tendencies, these different political currents, because the ideation of the class in struggle is such that it emanates these forms. And you know, wishing it away is like saying we're going to excise from the real situation experience. You know, we want people to accept that there should be one party and it should unite on what basis? Thank you very much. Oh, well, you know, experience is the teacher. You cannot substitute for political experience. And so that's a democratic thing. The fact that we have, you know, 7 parties competing with their wares at the entrance to the International Women's Day rally is just you know, a less salubrious feature of the overall situation. But it's one that we have to, I think, accept with some equanimity. But then the question is, how do we behave given that there are 5, 10, 15, or 20 different political groups on the left? And our attitude is, and I hope it is this way in practice, our attitude is we need to behave in a cooperative way, in a respectful way, insisting on our rights. I hate nothing more than groups on the left, and often, not often, occasionally even anarchists will say, we don't want you selling your newspaper at this anti-poverty rally. No, we will sell our newspaper. We will hand out leaflets. We will have our banner, even if we have to step back and make it visible on the outer orbit of this action, because we are for democratic debate. We are for unity on the basis of equality and respect and freedom of discourse. And we think that the best ideas will come to the forefront in that way. And that's why we hold to that principle. Not because we think we're necessarily correct, but because we think we have an indispensable contribution to make. And if our contribution proves to be inadequate or unfounded or just dead wrong, the masses will decide that. And we'll accept that judgment, and we'll change accordingly or be reduced to the margins. And that is something that is resolved in political practice. The unity of theory and practice is praxis. That's what we subscribe to. That's why we fight for workers' democracy. And that's why we think it's indispensable. And in the gig economy, the precarious workers, they have a certain freedom, but they also have a certain desperation. And what did they do when they get the chance? They tried to organize a union. So when the food couriers went to the Ontario Labor Relations Board recently, and they got the right to organize because they're considered dependent contractors, not independent contractors, that's a victory for the entire working class, not just for the young guys and girls on bicycles who are delivering food with the stuff weighing on their backs so heavily. And the Uber drivers, they're trying to form a union too. And that's the future, organization. You need to centralize the struggle. The workers need the resources. We will win the resources when we organize. And when we organize a revolutionary party, we will win the world. Thank you. Say goodbye. Good night, folks. We'll be back at you soon. I hope you enjoyed this dialogue. If you enjoyed it half as much as I did, then you must be thrilled. So recommend it to your friends. Get our publications and stay tuned. Go to our website, which is www.socialistaction.ca, and there we'll let you know when we can come out of the living room and into the hallways and into the streets in order to fight for a workers' agenda. You can count on us doing that.
Don't forget.
Thanks for joining us tonight.
Workers united will never be defeated.
True enough.
Right.
Great. Good job.